special morning together. Let's begin as always in prayer, and let's just give glory to God. Glory be to the Father, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, and ever shall be, world without end. Parents, alumni, friends, guests, Providence Academy, and welcome to all others joining via live stream. Special welcome to our friends and Kendall Qualls, who will be interviewing our guests. Today marks the post-COVID reboot of the tradition of Pancakes of Providence, bringing our community together. I'm pleased that we are rebooting. Providence Academy places great emphasis on faith and reason. Both are about seeking truth and living in its light. In this, Providence differs from the trend in K-12 education that prioritizes subjective feelings over truth. We at Providence certainly recognize that feelings are important, yet as C.S. Lewis clarifies, the heart never takes the place of the head, but it can and should obey it. The newer trend, which Lewis himself saw beginning to emerge 80 years ago, reverses this. It suggests that there is a truth that you feel in your heart and the truth that I feel in my heart, but there's never justice that, as Socrates taught, we should seek together through careful examination. Providence Academy guides students by helping them to carefully examine ideas every day. Two notable examples of how this education operates in action were illustrated. In 2018, after the Parkland shooting, activist groups called American high school students who were understandably disturbed by it to walk out of their school for 17 minutes in order to advocate for public health. At Providence, students instead held a talk, don't walk event. The goal was to think through the issues rather than simply speak. And in 2021, many Minnesota schools were bracing for student emotional crises when a verdict would be reached in children. Providence instead focused on a learning outcome. We invited a retired state Supreme Court justice to educate students about the rule of law. He detailed arguments of prosecution and defense and trained students to move into the pursuit of the truth. Again, the goal was to think through the issues rather than simply to be led by emotion. Today's speaker is a social scientist who uses quantitative analysis and sincere effort to think clearly. He identifies ideas that have become part of our common consciousness because of emotionalized feelings. He subjects ideas to careful proof and efforts to find out if they are true. Dr. Reilly asks us to think clear, to cut through the fog and find ways to make real progress. Ms. Hogan of Providence and I heard Dr. Reilly speak in the fall. We were both immediately struck that it would be great. Dr. Wilfred Reilly combines clarity and wit in a winning combination. He is Associate Professor of Political Science at Kentucky State University, the state's oldest historically black college. He serves on the Board of Advisors of the Foundation Against Intolerant Racism, an organization Providence supports. Dr. Reilly is author most recently of Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About, which is 7. He is author as well of several other books and of many articles, both in academic and popular press. It is my great pleasure to introduce you, Wilfred Reilly.
All right, how are you guys? Good, glad to be here. So I'm Will Reilly. I'll skip a fair amount of my own intro here that was eloquently delivered by your own, I believe Headmaster is the title. But as most of you probably know, I'm an associate professor at Kentucky State University. I have written a couple of books, Hate Crime Hoax, non-provocatively titled How the Left is Selling a Fake Race War, Taboo, an earlier scholastic book called The $50 Million Question, which was purely academic and which at least 7 people read, and 2 chapters in what was recently the global #2 book on Amazon, the 1776 Project's Red, White, and Black. And as a Midwesterner who grew up in almost equally balmy Chicago and was here just a few months back for the Center for the American Experiment and FAIR Minneapolis events, I'm glad to be back in the Twin Cities area once again and on your lovely campus for the first time. And my talk today, so I actually have a couple microphones, so you guys can still hear me if I walk around, right? Okay. So a couple people were like, yeah, you loud bastard. But all right. So my talk today doesn't really have a hyper formal title. I try to write a new one for each quote unquote client or each new friend. But it continues the theme that I talk about most often, which is this disconnect between perception and reality in modern American life. And something that I find very often, not just as an opinion guy, but as a professional researcher in my collegiate role, is that in the sort of modern MSNBC versus OAN era, there's often a great deal of very pervasive fear that's based on pretty much nothing, on nonsense. I tend to use a cruder word when I'm talking to all adult business audiences. And this is especially true among kind of the policy shaping upper middle class, by the way, which I assume is pretty well represented in the room. The people who consume the most media. And where you find the most crazy opinions, like 41% of those who get COVID are going to die. That's an actual belief, by the way. I don't mean to even slightly exaggerate it. I believe the actual was 41% of Democrats believe that at least half of those who get COVID-19 are going to go to the ICU or die. The actual figure, of course, COVID-19 is nothing to play around with, but the actual figure was something on the order of 1%. So why are people so afraid? Why do people believe so much crazy nonsense? That's the thing I actually look at professionally. We're going to talk about it today, and then I'm going to take some questions from the many citizens and the many top kind of young scholars in the audience. So I look forward to doing that. But if I have a thesis sentence here, it's that free speech, the ability to actually talk, actually say what you think in reality, on social, when you do research, is critically important because quote unquote experts today are very, very often pompous but wrong. And it's very important that we, and to some extent especially you young, intelligent individuals, have the range and the freedom to kind of expose that when necessary. Very often, large groups of people are blindly going along with things that are obviously false in the current moment. This has nothing to do with my talk, and I don't plan on, making fun of this particular topic today, but human sex is hard to define, strikes me as one of the most obvious of these. A tough thing to figure out. I don't really think that's true. But I think that I could go through a couple of pretty easy ways to explain why it's not. But to some extent, the theme of both of my books has been taking a close look at the mainstream, accepted, middle-class narrative, especially on the political left, and seeing whether it makes any sense at all. Do the core claims, the big arguments, do they factually hold together? The book Hate Crime Hoax, for example, has one simple theme. I look at all, really, the book's about 400 pages long, of these recent racial and social class controversies. And this is true on the left and on the quote-unquote alt-right, by the way. So you're talking about, Jussie Smollett, Yasmin Saweed, Bubba Wallace, Covington Catholic. That was actually an institution pretty similar to this one that I've given some money to in Kentucky, where the claim was that young athletes from that institution surrounded a Native American Indian elder and abused him, threatened to take his sacred rain drum away, chanted "Build the Wall," which is, excuse the language, a damned ironic thing to say to an Indian. And It turned out, of course, that none of this was true, and I discuss why at some length. But so I go through the book and I ask a very simple question. Did the media and academic storyline turn out to be accurate? And if not, why not? Taboo does the same controversial questions theme, but on a larger scale. So the outline of that book is that I took what were then 10 of the most widely reported on narratives in the country. So the Black Lives Matter take on police violence, and of course we all deplore extreme police violence, but the quote-unquote barbecue Becky era coverage of interracial crime, even the claims of the alternative right. And I asked whether what both left and right media encouraged their fans to say had anything to do with reality, what sort of easily available facts actually said. And what I consistently found 2 times running is that the conventional narratives, at least early on, pretty rarely match reality. And it's critical. It's sometimes literally a matter of life and death to stop, literally shaking and be able to sit down and actually talk about that. So to go kind of line by line through Taboo, which is something from the few student mails I've gotten and so on, something people were pretty interested in, the sort of accepted, again, up-middle class narrative on policing and race, at least until very recently, was the quote-unquote BLM storyline of constant violence. So the journalist and protest leader Chernobiko, originally I think Thomas Harrison, but I'd have to confirm that, but famously went on Fox News primetime and said that about one innocent, presumably unarmed, black man is murdered, that's a direct quote, by the cops every day. There's a best-selling book on Amazon right now by a guy I've sparred with on Twitter a couple of times, Open Season, The Legal Genocide of Colored People, written by Benjamin Crump, that lawyer who seems to show up within minutes every time someone gets abused by the police. And he argues that this total of, again, innocent, unarmed people killed by law enforcement is thousands per year. And people believe this because there's no reason they wouldn't, right? Like, there's no reason you wouldn't think that what the nation's best attorney says is true at some level. So, for example, there was a well-done, we would say, study from the Skeptic Research Center. This is obviously pretty serious stuff, which found that something like 33% of people who ID as very liberal believe that the average number of specifically unarmed, specifically black men killed annually by American police is about 1,000. Another 14 or 15% believe that the figure is about 10,000. And more than 7% thought it was more than that. Among just standard liberals, which is to say kind of anyone over to the center, the same figures were, if I recall correctly, 26% or so, 6 to 7%, that's for about 10,000, the 7%, and then 6% for more than that. And I don't want to drone on about this for too long, but conservatives, right-wing guys, didn't do all that much better. And this wasn't even alone. There's another study, The Social Construction of Racism, by my boy, actually, my fellow political scientist, Eric Kaufman, which found that 80% of African Americans and 60% of educated white liberals believe that young men, especially young black men, are more likely to be shot by the police than to die in car crashes. So this came out pretty recently. To put this in context, the total number of unarmed black men killed by police officers in the most recent year on record, which is 2020, was actually 18. And many people know this by now, but it's worth saying the number again, 18. Less than 250 black people in particular total were shot and killed by officers. And only about 1,021 people of all races were killed by police in that year. In contrast, as read the car wreck figure, there are up to 50,000 auto wreck deaths in a typical year. This again gets into that distinction between what we're afraid of and what's actually going to kill you, by the way. The actual leading cause of death for men is heart disease. I noticed that I myself, while still a competent enough pickup athlete, am about 40 pounds overweight. So when I've asked my doctor what I could actually do to extend my life, he said things like stop eating bacon and drive slower. So the terrors we have, 10 warriors from the other ethnic group jumping out of a panel van and doing you in, those don't have anything to do with reality. But getting back to the point, so there are 50,000 car wrecks per year that are fatal. There are only about 15 to 20,000 murders total. Those are concentrated among young men of all races. But the figure that people are giving for unarmed black men shot by cops is about the total for all people shot by anyone. So, again, I don't want to drone on and on about each one of these, but the same difference between popular and promoted narrative and what reality turned out to be exists with interracial crime and conflict in general, which is the second chapter of Taboo. So the conventional storyline, obviously, especially when I wrote the book, which was in 2019, 1 year before COVID, but focused on all of these people that were gaining nicknames for their quote-unquote evils, Barbecue Becky and Pool Patrol Paula. The New York Times once ran a series of front-page stories on black and white couples that got into fistfights in dog parks. And of course, this is an actual fact. And of course, more seriously, we hear frequently about the quote-unquote alt-right attackers of blacks and Asians, more sporadically of minority violence against whites. But when I started looking at this, myself and a research team headed up by Jane Lingle, who's done some of this work on these books, the immediate discovery was that serious interracial crime of any kind is actually extremely rare, contra radicals of every kind. The person most likely to kill you is your current husband or your ex-wife. And I guess I'll go with the joke that I made in my very first speech about this. I do think there are some psychological differences there, where men tend to be kind of stupid and brutish. You might find out your partner's cheating. It's your current husband that attacks you. Ex-wife implies an ability to hate for a long time. There's intelligence and darkness there. But so anyway, but the person most likely to kill you is your lover, your intimate partner. But beyond that, something like 70% of all violent crimes against blacks, African Americans, 61 to 65% of all those against whites are committed by somebody of the same race, usually that you knew. Violent interracial crimes involving black people and white people, and this is a good reminder for everyone that fear-mongers about this. The right wing does this as much as the left, in my opinion. But violent interracial crimes of this kind were about 3% of total crime in the year we looked at. It's easy to measure this. There's an annual crime report. There were 20 million crimes, robberies, and things of that nature. 600,000 were violent crimes that involved a black perp and a white victim, or a white perp and a black victim. And I will add one politically incorrect note. With all that said, this is an odd thing for the minority side to focus on. The interracial crime that does occur is very, very heavily, quote-unquote, POC on white, since there are 5 times as many white people and they still have more money. When we looked, it was about 80% black on white as versus white on black. Media reporting cuts in the exact opposite direction for a variety of reasons, shameless lying being one of them. But I think another being a desire not to arouse, the ancient hates in the country or something like that. But during that same year, 2018, interracial crime involving African Americans and whites was, as I said, 80% plus black on white. That's unusual, but it's been 70+% in that direction every year that I've looked. So I don't really think this is something that we necessarily need to talk a lot about at all. 3% is 3%. But if the media insists on discussing race constantly, this is something people are going to start pointing out. So the same disconnect that makes free speech and analysis necessary pops up when we look at a lot of these race issues, like systemic racism, quote unquote, more broadly. And this is the last race topic. After that, we're going to talk about COVID and how they're lying to you. They, the military, how they're lying to you. They. I actually have like 12 possible options in here, but I'm probably going to shut up at some point so you guys can ask questions. But it does seem to be almost universally accepted on the modern university or prep school campus, I'll say at least in public sober, that all disparities in performance between racial and sexual and regional groups have to indicate some kind of subtle discrimination. This seems to be the currently conventional narrative. Scholars like Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo have made a career out of this claim. So at root, the good Dr. Kendi's argument is really extraordinarily simple. What he says is that any gap in performance between two large groups has to be due to one of two things. Either quote-unquote racism or racist policy, it's his usual term, no matter how hidden and subtle and barely discoverable anywhere by anyone, or two, inferiority, which he says pretty openly on the part of one of the groups. So either like a gap somewhere is caused by racism or group B is genetically inferior. And this, while hardly brilliant, is actually an extremely powerful argument. Because what Dr. Kendi is saying is implicitly, if you don't accept his argument and kind of truffle hound with him for racism, you are a racist. By the literal definition of this MacArthur genius, you must believe blacks are inferior to whites, or whites are genetically poorer athletes and artists, or whatever the individual topic might be. You have to believe that. But in fact, taking this argument fully seriously in 2023 requires us to ignore more and more visible outliers. So almost no one who has worked on Wall or LaSalle Street, or played a varsity sport, or watched a spelling bee, can believe that all or most of the most successful citizens of the USA are still sort of rural Anglo-Americans. So it turns out that this sort of passing impression is correct. So there actually is a formal list. If any of you are really interested in this and ranking your group, if you're of Nigerian extraction or whatever, there's a formal list of U.S. ethnic groups by personal and household income that's been up on Wikipedia and Encyclopedia Britannica for about 10 years now. And according to this, the most successful American population group is actually Indian Americans, who make almost twice the national average at $126,000 per year. Last I looked, number 2 was Taiwanese Americans. Most other East Asians also do very well. Number 3 was Filipino Americans. Southeast Asians tend to do pretty solidly. Jews and Australians were clearly up there in the Caucasian category. At least the first of those groups has hardly been free of discrimination historically. South Africans or Nigerians, for my group broadly, always place well on the list. West Africans overall do very well, and so on down the line. So these kind of exceptions to the systemic racism claim, which now stretch across whole continents, pull us into the realm of real and serious methodology, to use the professional term. So almost everyone competent and heterodox who has ever looked at this topic across fields, Thomas Sowell, Amy Chua, Roland Fryer, June O'Neill, Heather McDonald, Walter Williams, over in economics, perhaps me, has pointed out that large groups that vary in terms of important or at least visible characteristics like race and sex also almost invariably are different at what you'd call the mean, the average, in terms of other characteristics and traits. So to give maybe the most obvious and least controversial, which I lead with in almost every speech, the most common age for a black male. But I mean, all banter aside, the most common age for a black male, it would be fully fair to call this the modal average. Average age for a black guy is 27. The modal average for a white male, in contrast, is 58. So any comparison of at least men of the two races, whether we're talking about wealth and income on the quote-unquote left, or crime rates on the right, that doesn't adjust for the fact that there's a 30-year age difference, that guy A is up to 30 years older than guy B, strikes me as intentionally dishonest. Even the median gap between these groups, which can be a little different, is 8 to 12 years by state. So, I mean, there are tons of differences like these between people. And I'm going to do this one, then do COVID, and then kind of hear questions from you guys. But the basic idea of there must be some kind of plot out there is almost invariably wrong. So, I mean, again, going back into the reasons why groups might differ in performance, just 15% of whites, but almost 50% of both blacks y Latinos still live in the South and Southwest as versus the North and Northeast. So, I mean, another one, a little more controversial, but the white SAT score is invariably 1050 plus still right now. Last year it was 11, 18, I think. Asians are still smoking everyone, by the way, for the high school students in the audience. The Asian average was 12, 30 or something like that. So these conflicts among American groups are all for second place right now. But at any rate, do better, Yankees. But at any rate, though, I mean, if you're looking at why people make different amounts of money, it really matters. The white score is generally 1050. Well, the black score was 950, 970 for Hispanics, so on down the line. Again, Asian Americans, well over 1,200. All of this is obviously incredibly relevant specifically to income, which was the dependent variable that I chose to open with here, and the DV that more than anything else is almost invariably attributed to racism or to sexism when gaps arise. So this is really kind of the overall thesis here. As virtually every author that I just cited, that I just brought up, points out, adjusting for obvious, how would you say this, cultural, regional, structural, but not racial, etc., variables closes almost every gap in terms of what people earn and how people do, either massively or totally, 100%. And to some extent, speaking to an audience of, serious, ready to go to top colleges students, this point just makes sense. When people talk about the race and gender gaps in wages, for example, if any cynical, amoral businessman could hire a black guy or a businesswoman for 70% the wage of a white frat guy with the exact same skills, why wouldn't this happen constantly? Driving the unemployment rate for those groups down to almost zero. I would have done nothing but that as a boss. And I can't imagine that I'm alone. And so on. I hesitated to bring this up, but the difference between sort of, picture taking period's over. But okay, so in terms of this overall theme of a lot of what you hear and a lot of what you're expected to believe is almost sacred is kind of BS. It sort of took a long time there, but The police information, not really true. The races are at war with one another, not really true. You're being held down by someone. Obviously, racism still exists, but that's not really true. The most successful group in the country is Indian Americans. And this same sort of thing of, why not go to the library or subscribe to the Wall Street Journal and just check out the data, that applies almost anywhere. I kind of hesitated to talk about this after 2 years of people sitting around in masks glaring at each other. But this difference between mainstream perception and empirical reality certainly also applies to the COVID-19 pandemic that we saw, crisis that we just saw. So last year, I mentioned that, at least on the left side of the aisle, a huge number of people think that most people who get COVID die. And this is just one of many findings of this kind. Last year, the international consulting brand Kext, K-E-K-S-T-C, Kext, C-N-C, I believe, found that the average American believes that 9% of the population has already died of COVID. Now, that was a year ago, but it's worth repeating. I mean, I see the usual dazes that you do in any large academic audience, but the average American thinks that 10% of the population is dead. Like the COVID pandemic killed 1 person in 10. So you can find this astonishing professional report, which is now publicly available just by Googling the name of the company. Just KEK will bring it up, and COVID Opinion Tracker. And I will note that Americans were not alone in our panic. As I recall, the Europeans were a little smarter than we were about the numbers, but a little more cowardly given what they thought the numbers were. You can draw broader conclusions from that if you want to. But I think the estimates were the UK thought that 7% of the population was dead. Denmark, maybe 3%. 5% for France, I'm absolutely certain on that one, and so on down the line. And again, you have to wonder how these numbers are formed. I mean, if this were actually true, in every row, each of you would have lost, say, 2 friends. But look around, pick them out. Who do you value the most? There's actually a story that I shared with your headmaster on the way here that relates to my own training in college that's totally inappropriate that I won't tell. But well, I'll actually tell the censored. No, it's not going to work. There's not really a way to censor it. Anyway, but I mean, so this COVID thing, this belief was, actually the short version of the story is when I went to the University of Illinois, there was this week-long men's training that went into all of this graphic stuff about sexual orientation and so on down the line. And at one point, the men's head stood up in front of all of us and said, look around you. Within this row, there are 2 guys that are going to be X, 2 guys that are going to be Y, 2 guys that are going to turn into blank. And I just looked down the row and resolved not to talk to any of those guys for the entire rest of my time at the school. So anyway, I'm a man of my word. But anywho, but in all seriousness, though, these beliefs that 10% of the population is dead, all banter and all joking aside, this was the primary trackable reason for mass support for lockdowns. I don't know what your policy for masking and so on here was in Minnesota. I'm sure you'll tell me during Q&A. In Kentucky, we were a pretty open, red state, but I also live in the state's largest city. So, I mean, it was probably what you saw in most places. I mean, people were eating outside, separated by 8 feet in the winter and so on. And this was driven by this level of data understanding. So these doomsday predictions about COVID have been going on since a specific moment when a British man named Neil Ferguson estimated that 2 million people would die of COVID-19 before October of 2020 and first shut down the USA. So the reality is that COVID-19 was and to some extent is obviously very real. I'm pro-vaccine, or at least was during the first round. But the total number of people lost to the disease in the USA actually is close to 1 in 300 across the population over 3 years. The average victim, at least in Kentucky, and this is up to today, has been about 80 years of age. If you've taken the vaccine or you have, by this point, what's called NI, natural immunity to COVID, your risk of death if you get the disease, looking at the age range in the room, is about 1 in 10 to 20,000. Talk to your doctor. That's probably about the range. So simply mentioning much of this, many of these essentially undisputed facts, got you banned from social media for the better part of a year. All of them turned out to be either largely or entirely true. None of them are currently challenged, and the Jay Bhattacharya's of the world and so on have returned to the academic conferences. So why does this kind of disconnect keep happening? Why are there people on MSNBC or Fox in primetime saying that the police are committing genocide? A lot of this gets into what experts are and even into what science is. So science is not, in fact, this one set of perfect and agreed upon facts that people seem to think it is. The conclusions that experts, quote unquote, come to are shaped very, very much by their field of study and by their political biases and just by whether they are smart or stupid. So a big part of this is what, as a political science guy, we call siloing. So people tend to go into fields of business, and many of you will see this in your own life as executives and so on. I mean, you choose firms that tend to include people that look and act much like you, and it's actually a good idea to get a little outside that bubble. But fields of business and academia, where this is more troubling, and so on, alongside those who think like them. Said 5? Okay. So last I looked, about 97% of sociologists, these are the people who tell us what to think about race and class in the USA, are political leftists. 18% of all social scientists identify as Marxists or communists, according to the pretty serious website EconLab. In contrast, if I need to say the obvious out loud, only about 0.5% of all regular Americans are communists. Raise your hand if you're a communist. I was genuinely curious. This is a high school, prep school. You might have a communist in here. I am very edgy and different. I wear a red skirt and the boys love me. Okay, no, not one? All right, fair enough. So, and while it pains me heart to hear it, to say it, this is just as true on the other side. ROTC, military science, and my own discipline lean 94% to the right. I have no personal hate for that, but this is how you get claims like all U.S. wars were justified. The USA has never lost a war. So there are a ton of practical effects of siloing. I'll give one. I'll take out one of the examples in the speech as we're moving toward the end. But one of the most basic is that for decades, across all of social science, authoritarianism, which is kind of a preference for strongman leaders, and broad government actions like vaccine mandates, was thought of as a right-wing thing. Like conservatives, and especially men, were thought to be the people who wanted to control others, while left-wingers, and especially women, were thought to be the ones saying things like, get your dirty government hands off my rights. But that's because the tools and surveys that we were using to measure authoritarianism were often designed by activists. And so they asked questions like, how important is it that the government keep control of political radicals like communists and environmental activists? And we obviously found that 80 to 90% of the people saying that this was very, very important were right-wing dudes. But just a few years back, a center-right PhD student at Emory University in the US South revised the scale to ask about the importance of controlling, for example, homophobes or transphobes, racists, anti-maskers. I'm using some hypothetical categories. Many people have used the scale since. But as I recall, one of his was people stuck in the old traditional ways. The religious zealots was one of them. And it now seems, as people are using these newer techniques, that the majority of authoritarians are maybe on the political left. And so something like 200 famous predictions about what would happen in U.S. business and politics turned out just to be wrong as a result. But again, what results you get here, who the bad guys are, depends totally on what scale you decide to use. That's a good line that sums up much of this little talk, in fact. There are many other examples of this. You may be sick of them by now. But for my own dissertation, this is the last one, for my own college thesis, I looked at the question that's often used to, quote unquote, prove white privilege. The idea that white guys value themselves more than everyone else, have, great advantages in this, racist, sexist, heterosexist, post-colonial, cis-sexist, I could go on with this for a while, but whatever society. And in 1992, a guy named Andrew Hacker asked a group of white college students how much they would have to be paid to be black. The average answer was $50 million. And this is the figure that's often used to show the value of white status in this institutionally, I'm not going to go through it all again, racist society. But as it turned out, Hacker didn't ask any black guys how much they'd have to be paid to be white. So for my college project, I asked a few thousand, really, of my buddies, our acquaintances. We polled fraternities on campus, so on. And most of these happened to be upper middle class black and Asian guys at the time. That exact question. And the average answer from the minority men was $80 million. Now, you have to adjust for inflation. There'd been 10 or 15 years in the interregnum. But there also was a high level of just ethnic pride. Guys had fun with it, asking things like whether they'd still be able to dance, whether they'd have to wear polo shirts. But they also cited very serious advantages like affirmative action and Asian culture. And that grew into the big paper that got me my job, that became the first book, which, as I've noted, 7 people read. And we now know, because someone asked the question in a different way, that minorities are just as racist, quote unquote, or at least as group identified and proud as whites are. So the point here isn't that I'm always right. I'm sure I'm often wrong, and someone will come back and focus on Hispanics and rebut me in 20 years. But rather that it's free speech that made every sort of truth-finding, heterodox experiment that I've described so far possible. It's new generations of people coming up that keep free speech going. I hope that continues. Go forth and do good, guys.
Do you want to sit or do you want to stand?
I'm fine standing. I got the mic.
Great. So thank you so much, Dr. Reilly. So I get the privilege of asking you the first question. And, we modern people in the West see ourselves as the most enlightened, most rational. How come it is that we get our heads colonized by ideas that aren't true?
I think there's a strong human desire to believe in there are a couple things. I think there's a strong human desire to believe in legend and myth. And to some extent also in the West, I think we've forgotten a lot of our traditions that were sort of inoculations against that. So when you talk to people in other societies, there were traditions that were sort of, I prefer ours, but they were near rival stars, like the Tao in the East. There's the Orthodox Church in Eastern Europe. And those still exist. So when ideas like men and women are identical are brought up in those societies, there's a long historical and philosophical tradition that makes laughing at them possible. When you said that this institution is founded on reason and revelation, would be pretty close. Yeah. But Athens and Jerusalem, those are kind of, right now this might be things people are chattering at you about in your philosophy class, but that really is the basis of the West, the combination of traditional, often religious virtue with Greek and Roman reason, which produced the world's most powerful civilization against very strong rivals from places like China. And I think we've forgotten a lot of the tradition of reason and revelation. People used to be able to cite from Plato or from the Christian Bible in the way that an educated Chinese can from Confucius or Lao Tzu today. So I think in the absence of that, you do see kind of a gap where a lot of the postmodernists and so on came in to get into the philosophy. The one-sentence answer is that a lot of the nonsense we're hearing now is what's called critical theory. Critical theory began as something almost useful. It was a criticism, like the feminists, for example. We're criticizing society as it existed in the 1950s. And we're saying this isn't too fulfilling in a lot of the most important, intimate ways for me as a woman. But critical theory is only valuable if you know about what you're criticizing. And I think now with a lot of students that don't have that kind of traditional education, for a lot of students that don't have that kind of traditional background, you don't know about what you're criticizing, you just know the criticisms. And that leaves you very vulnerable. I mean, I would say that there are far more young Westerners who know who, say, Malcolm X is than the Wright brothers or Aeschylus or something like that. So I think that's why it's harder for a lot of people to respond to this. It's just a lack of information. Even last sentence, but even for the things we were talking about today, like these are the actual numbers on police shootings. You'd only know that if you're aware of this sort of obscure Washington Post database that they don't promote that heavily. So the real question is, why are there these people promoting this narrative based on false information that's very damaging to society? And that's a tough question. The answer that comes to mind quickly is that they don't like the society very much.
Thank you so much. Let's place priority on student questions here for a few minutes. And I've got to ask our upper school director if we're going to be able to have a few extra minutes.
Yeah.
A few extra minutes? Gotcha. Very good. So student questions. At the very, very top, yes, sir. And we'll try to repeat your question if people can't hear it.
What contains fake information? Sorry.
So your question kind of, where do you go if you want the correct, real information? Yeah, okay. If you want to know something about something that's controversial, you're hearing a narrative, where do you go to find out whether it's true or not?
I think a great answer would be the library. I don't mean to be at all glib, but I mean, like, there are books. If you want to read, say, a good African-American social scientist take on policing, like William Julius Wilson's, like, they're mostly good, but there's some racism, and then read The Comeback from a Cop. I'd probably recommend my buddy Maury Richards, The Boys with the Badge or something like that. If you read those two books, you probably understand policing. You just have to fight your way through. And by this point in high school, you probably wouldn't be fighting your way, but you just have to read through, almost as an assignment, 600 pages of that material, and then that's the knowledge of policing. And because that's almost a task, a lot of people will instead turn on, which one of these guys do I dislike the most? Probably Don Lemon. I mean, you'll just watch these very shorthand versions like, yeah, they sometimes go too far, don't they? Yeah, I'd say they do, Don. And that very condensed version of information is very subject to easy, quick manipulation. So I think that the short version is just like the library, the journals, even a good newspaper. Like, everyone knows the New York Times slants left or the Wall Street Journal slants right, but in a 3-page editorial, they're not just making things up. So the closer you get to an original primary source, I think, the better. Or just talk to a cop, go on a ride-along. Draw your own conclusions about what, like, crime in Minneapolis looks like.
Thank you so much. Other student questions? Yes, ma'am.
Sort of.
The question is, do media exaggeration of numbers in certain directions somehow negate the seriousness of matters at hand?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, so obviously, if someone were to ask me, I've had people ask me this during debates, like, do you think cops should just be able to beat people to death? And it's like, well, no. I mean, so I think that there are basic points on which we can agree. Like, I think if I were hanging out with my feminist ex and my buddy who's a priest, and I asked them both, is murder bad? They would say yes. So the starting points are important, But when we make policy, we do, and I'm speaking from, to some extent, a policymaker level. I mean, I was until recently an executive. I was the ombudsman, not the president. But at a decently major university, I mean, I expect in the future I'll probably hold some kind of local office. You make policy based on numbers. I mean, if there's a road in your town known as Death Curve where there have been 50 car accidents, that's probably where you're going to concentrate your roadway design efforts, your new stop signs, that kind of thing. So when someone says, I don't obviously mean to compare this to something as mundane as highway design, but if someone says, well, there are 10,000 unarmed men being killed every year by the police, I would say we need national reforms. We may need abolition. If it turns out the real figure is 7, no, that doesn't negate those 7 deaths, but I think that what we then need is to arrest 7 guys. I mean, so it does put the situation in a completely different context. And it's the same thing with COVID, last line, but I mean, the argument with COVID-19 originally, if you remember Neil Ferguson, I don't know if you read his paper, I suspect you may have, but the argument was that we were going to lose 2 million people in 2 months, that the IFR for the virus was 3%, whatever it was. It didn't differentiate based on age. So obviously, if the rage virus from the video games has landed in the country, you know, we're going to have to make some sacrifices. If it turns out that instead something 3 times as strong as flu has arrived and you can wear a mask for 2 months until there's a vaccine, totally different policies are mandated. So yeah, I do think that the severity, the impact of something affects how we treat it, yes.
Thank you very much. I saw another. Yes, sir. The question is, the professor mentioned that people of color and majoritarian whites very often have group pride, and you want to comment further?
Yeah, I mean, all people, so first of all, I think that a lot of the messages that target whites are almost unhealthy. Now, I'm certainly not like a dissident alt kind of guy. I think that, you know, I'm standing here wearing a suit. You guys go to a pretty good school. Like, all the complaining in America is just annoying. So, like, if white guys were to start saying, like, now we're oppressed, like, shut up. You know, like, I'm not saying you're doing this at all, but, like, I've been on trading floors where guys have started this, and it's like, you literally are sitting here in a bullpen. Like, go make some money. But the point of this, though, aside from the comment that I don't want to see more identitarianism responding to minority identitarianism, my initial point was that I think some of the comments that are made to whites are quite unfair. The idea that you shouldn't have racial identity or you shouldn't have pride in racial identity is rather unique. So yes, you're absolutely correct. Yeah, minorities have pride in their racial identities. Like, I would say I'm moderately proud to be Black and Irish, exactly as members of most white groups do. In fact, I'll tell you, whites in general test as the least racist major American group. If you're using racist, yeah, it is funny because there's so much invective, like the white supremacist society we live in. But if you're looking at a measure of racism, like wouldn't date interracially or something like that, hostility toward other groups, yeah, whites are generally, it's either whites or Hispanics that are the least prejudiced. Blacks and Asians tend to be a bit more prejudiced. When I did my dissertation work, the group that was the most bigoted, and I understand this is a bit of an outlier, was old Asian men. And it was almost funny. I mean, the comments on the one qualitative portion were things like, you know, we were living in castles when you Mayfly Westerners were, you know, still chasing the wild boar through the green forests of Ireland, if you get the reference, that kind of thing. But yeah, many people have pride in their people and their history. I think that that's targeted more for Caucasians right now than it generally is for other groups. But you certainly do find that with other groups. One very final comment, you find a weird split among whites. So there's a guy that I'm friends with named Zach Goldberg who looks at ethnic pride among people in general. And there's a famous 4-part graph where he looks at how people value themselves relative to members of other groups. And almost everyone likes other groups fine, like 70 plus, but rates their group like plus 10 higher. So it's like blacks, like whites, 70, blacks plus 14. Hispanics, like blacks, 68, Hispanics plus 13. Conservative whites, minorities, whatever, whites plus 12. Liberal whites, as I recall, they rated everyone else lower. They didn't really like anyone that much, if I recall. That could be off. But they also rated whites 11 points lower than minority groups. So you see a weird split among Caucasians there. But in general, the ethnic pride is extremely common. Long rambling answer there.
Let's have one more question from a student. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
The question is about police shootings during 2020. The point was this was a lockdown time. Might that have adversely affected the analysis you did?
That one was right over the plate. As it happens, yeah. The numbers are pretty much the same every year. One thing I will say about the COVID lockdowns, like one of my stories about COVID. I saw one of my buddies during the first. I didn't lock down for COVID. I certainly didn't want to harm seniors or anything like that. I had no problem masking or in groups until the vax came out, so on. But I mean, like Kentucky was a pretty open state. Stores were open. We didn't shut down anything outside because we actually read the reports about the virus, which I think a lot of states should have done. So, I mean, people did a lot more outdoor exercise. People were out there hooping. You went to the market. We wanted to support small business. But I was inside more. But I talked to one of my guys who is an Italian-American guy from back home in Chicago, and I assumed he would have locked down. And he said, well, no. I mean, in Chicago, something like 65% of the workers are essential. So you college boys might have been inside on your laptops ordering food, but who do you think was delivering the food? And I'm working on a road crew, so we're not going to stop filling in the potholes. Like, no, we're all out there all day. So I think point one of the big lies through all this in terms of how could 300,000 people have died from COVID, how did lockdowns fail so badly, something both the left and the right need to realize is that it was almost impossible to lock down here, even in most of Europe. So that was some of the kabuki that we see in politics. I think that's an almost forgotten part of the story. Now, that didn't really have much to do with your question. I just think that's interesting, that's sort of widely ignored. But in terms of are the policing numbers similar? Yeah. The numbers of unarmed men shot by police are tiny every year. I mean, in 2015, when I first started looking for Taboo, the total number of unarmed black men shot was like 38. The number of unarmed black men unprovokedly shot by white cops was like 17. And it went down from there. Partly because of BLM, more because of an alternate set of police reforms that had started the year before. But I mean, the year after that, I think it was 18. Next year was 20. Last year, as we fully unlocked from COVID, it was 7. And that is despite more conflict between young brothers, quote unquote, and the police following what's called the Floyd effect. I mean, it's still, there just aren't that many. So you could argue that the entire movement caused a great deal of social tension and damaged race relations for no reason, if you were a cynical person.
Well, thank you very much. I will share something that I learned from Dr. Reilly last night, and it's interesting, and it may be a kind of a glimmer of hope for somebody who subjects ideas to the kind of analysis that you're urging us to do, and that is that you've been approached by people from both major political parties to run as a candidate on their ticket, which I think is very interesting.
Yeah, I have gotten some approaches. I will tell you, my partner, to use the politically correct term, is like her attitude toward that is much less excited than even my unenthusiastic attitude. Like, no, I don't want people digging through like my college social media. Like, the level of opposition research, not that I think either of us is all that much out there, but the level of candidate oppo research and the dirtiness of political campaigns is at an all-time high. So I think I might prefer just to be a casual writer. You're holding a beer and a picture and you're under 21. I mean, that's going to be on a page somewhere.
That's actually very good advice.
To you guys, like, so stay clean, kids.
Thank you.
That's the point.
Thank you. That's why we had him here today. So, students have an opportunity, I think there's already been a sign up, but have an opportunity to have lunches with Dr. Reilly a little bit later. I want to thank everybody who's joined us live stream. Everybody here, fantastic. Dr. Reilly, let's hear it for him again.